Hello, viewers, and welcome to the latest episode of the Huddle. I'm joined by a very familiar face, an old guest, old friend, Oliver Lovat, CEO of Denstone Group and regular Gaming America contributor. Oliver, thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Tim. How are you?
Very well, thanks, and how are you?
Oh, we're great. Great. All is hotting up nicely in Las Vegas this summer.
Yeah, I mean it's even warm here in London, which is an absolute rarity. But yeah, plenty to discuss with Vegas, which we will do today.
Yeah, you have no idea how hot it is. It's a virtual oven. So it's a pleasure to be inside talking to you rather than outside.
Yeah, with the aircon on. Well, we're running this interview in accompaniment really with your latest article for Gaming America magazine, talking about the 5 properties that really made Las Vegas, and we know you're an expert in the history of the region and the space. Maybe to start off with, we've got the closures of the Tropicana and the Mirage, potentially, well, not potentially, changing the landscape of Vegas. If we're to look ahead before we look back, how might that change things? We're kind of looking at a helicopter view of Vegas.
So there's 2 things. First of all, there's the historical position, because both these properties are part of the rich tapestry and legacy of the city. The Tropicana is again one of the oldest properties on the Strip. It also means there's going to be, 5,000 additional rooms coming to the market. So that means that with the newer properties that have opened up, there's a chance to try and capture those customers. And then we wait in anticipation for the new properties that are going to rise in the rubble, from the rubble of the Mirage and the Tropicana, whether they're coming in 2 years or 5 years. The city continues to reinvent with new properties and new ideas. And I think everybody who lives out here has their favorite property or can point to various turning points in the city. And what I wanted to try and do, having had this discussion with so many people, is offer my rationale for what I think the properties were that changed Las Vegas. And thank you for allowing me the opportunity to sit down and take this discussion and research it properly and offer, my 5 to your readers.
No, absolutely. It's our pleasure to include them. You touched on the properties that might be coming in place of the Mirage and Tropicana in the future. That's something we'll touch on later on. But when you talk about Vegas always changing, it's crazy to think, first of all, that when we sat down at G2E, that was already about 8-9 months ago. It's amazing how time flies. But back then we touched on the sporting legacy that Vegas is now starting to build, and how it's the entertainment capital of the world after kind of so many changes in its evolution already.
Yeah, I think when we sat down last September, October time, the way I felt about the city was we were kind of at the end of one cycle and about to start the beginning of the next cycle. And there was something tangible about that in the air, that we've gone through this post-COVID period. It's been a bit of a cash grab by the operators. People have come and we've offered lots of high-end leisure experiences, but we're moving to that next phase as conventions have returned, as sport has come big time with the Super Bowl and Formula One. And I'll talk about this maybe a little bit at the end, the arrival of the Sphere, which has been now that it's open and we've seen it operating for 6-7 months, we can notice not just its attraction, but also its disruptive effect on the wider market.
Mm-hmm. As we say, plenty to look ahead to. But let's look back and your top 5 properties, or your 5 properties that changed Vegas. The first one, you've gone with the Stardust, and I wanted to do a little kind of word association, having read the article, which our readers will soon be able to access. The word that came to mind for me or the phrase, a couple did, but we've gone with mass market for this one. So Stardust, mass market. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so what's interesting is that, the Las Vegas, in particular the Strip, had already been knocking about for over a decade when the Stardust arrived. And what I found interesting was, with the Stardust, it opened with, and I've written a little bit about the history and the evolution of it, which itself could be a movie, right? The development and how it came to be. But when the Stardust opened in '58, it had over 1,000 rooms, albeit in a motel style. And if you put that into context, and excuse me, my numbers may be a little bit wary, but I think the Sands opened with 200 rooms, and the Desert Inn had 300, and the Riviera had about 290 odd. So you're talking about a property opening over 3 times the size of what the market was. And of course, when the Flamingo opened, famously, it didn't even have a hotel. So you're now taking Las Vegas, which was this small owner-managed properties, owner-operated properties, and creating something for the mass market, where the people that ran the properties weren't necessarily creating it for people like them. They were creating it for other people. So you saw when the Stardust opened, it wasn't just the desert motif. It gets a little bit more atomic age, a little bit more futuristic. It opened with a showroom rather than an entertainer. It had a drive-in movie theater. It had an RV park. It was a lot more mass market middle class than what the then existing Las Vegas offering was. And it encouraged people to come to Las Vegas that wouldn't necessarily have come there or thought it was beyond their price point. Over the time, the duration that the Stardust existed, and of course ownership changed, but there was significant mob influence in the property. You saw innovations led by Frank Rosenthal for decades. And it was the first sports book on the Strip. Not the first in Las Vegas, but it was the first on the Strip. And what we see now as the modern sports book comes from what Rosenthal implemented in the Stardust. And of course, when I say it could be a movie, that period was famously a movie in the film Casino. So there's so many stories to do with the Stardust and its evolution. And even when the mob were cleared and Boyd came in, it still didn't pretend to be anything that it wasn't. It became a very large, very successful mass market middle class property. And I think in many ways, the expansion of Las Vegas in the 80s and the 90s, the tone was set by the Stardust back in the 50s.
Mm-hmm. If you're perhaps to give that maybe like an influence rating out of 10 or out of 5 stars or whatever system we want to use, I guess because of that mass market opportunity that you talk about, I mean, how influential was the Stardust? Because it will be ranked very highly on the list now.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't the defining property of Las Vegas, but it certainly shifted how the business worked. It also meant, for example, that the casino could be bigger and lower, or it created that whole grind joint mass market casino floor. How was it? 7 to 8 in terms of influence? Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I think we should do this for every property, and we can have a nice little comparison. But next up is Caesar's Palace, still around, of course, iconic. I mean, I'm a Friends fan, so that's the casino they went to when they went for the trip in Friends. And the word that stood out to me from your section was escapism.
Yeah. So I've written in the past about Caesar's Palace in terms of the way Jay Sarno and Stan Mallon, who created and conceived Caesar's Palace, was a fusion of all their different experiences, from time spent in Italy to opening up motorhomes across America, the use of architecture and design and lighting, and visiting the Fontainebleau in Miami. It kind of all came together. Stan Mallon, before he passed away, said to me, and I always remember this, he said, "We captured lightning in a bottle with Caesar's Palace." So how much of it was deliberate and how much of it was, accidental due to the intuition of Sarno and his personality as a gambler? I'm going to think a lot of it was intuitive, right? Mm-hmm. And accidental. So that doesn't negate from its importance, but it completely redefined what a casino could be and what Las Vegas was. In terms of design, we're talking about the use of, again, trees, lighting, fountains, driveways. which are now ubiquitous and high-end properties, but were born out of Caesar's Palace. The use of the casino as the central hub where the energy is 24/7, born in Caesar's Palace. The idea of theming a casino or a resort was there in Caesar's Palace. And I mean, I guess we had Western themed properties, but nothing as flamboyant as what was seen in Caesar's. And also in terms of branding, Caesar's Palace was the first branded property that appealed primarily for its brand rather than who the entertainer was. To be honest, the sands, the desert, and the dunes, they were mainly interchangeable. And the rationale to stay was who the headliner was. Moreover, the idea of emotion and experience and escapism was front and center at Caesar's Palace. And I don't want to talk about Circa Circus because the two of them are kind of linked together, both created by Sarno and Malin. If one looks at Caesar's Palace, you have to kind of put a little bit alongside Circa Circus. So, for example, Circa Circus opened with 700 slot machines 2 years after Caesar's Palace opened. Caesar's had 200 slot machines. Caesar's had 6 bars and restaurants. Circa Circus had 14 bars. So the germination of what modern casinos were as they are now started at Caesar's Palace and expanded and iterated over the next 55 years. And by the way, if you look at it, all the other legacy properties that exist in Las Vegas and probably anywhere, only Caesar's Palace is the one that has continued to remain relevant today. And again, it's not something you can replicate. It is a brand and an experience that has resonance with customers, of every generation.
Mm-hmm. The point you made about kind of the casino floor being the hub and the center of the property, maybe a slight geographical digression, but that just isn't influential in Vegas because obviously you've got Macau and, we were in Manila recently and a lot of the casinos, they, reminded me just of a Vegas casino because you have that central hub. They all could have been, none of the ones I was at were like a MGM casino, but you could have easily mistaken it for MGM or a Caesars because of that concept that you mentioned of kind of casino right in the middle, and it kind of leads you everywhere else in the property. Influence rating out of 10?
10.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Emphatic. Sure. Interesting. Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah. So that'll take us to the Mirage, which was your third one. Interesting to see how that ranks in comparison. I got to stay there. Luckily, last year, people won't be staying there anymore. But the word innovation, really, for the Mirage.
Yeah, innovation, iteration. You got to remember, Caesars, when it opened, had 680 rooms. It wasn't a mega resort. And what happened with Caesars was it expanded to meet demand over the years. I have a quote. I don't know if I actually put it in the article, but I have a quote from Alan Feldman, who opened the Mirage with Steve Wynn, long-term Mirage executive, and he said, it is worth noting that Steve Wynn gave Sarno credit for establishing the template for a casino design, a spectacular entry, a sense of place throughout the property, and with the casino serving as the main artery for everything else, with restaurants and retail ringing the spaces. As Feldman said to me, Wynn once said, if you could find an original Caesar's Palace ground plan and overlay the Mirage, they'd be almost identical. So what I said before with Sarno having this raw intuition on casino design and customer psychology, Wynn bought into it. And again, when I wrote my piece for you guys on Sarno a couple of months back, Heidi said to me, when they would go out for dinner on a Friday night, Steve Wynn, who was a young casino developer, would often join them on Friday night, and he and Wynn and Sarno would discuss casino design for hours, on a Friday night at the country club. So, there is clearly a lineage, an iterative lineage between Caesar's Palace and Wynn's properties, which are the Mirage Bellagio, and then Treasure Island, and all the other ones in Macau, and the Wynn, of course. So what the Mirage did, and I've heard many executives talking about that before, is they took a step back, and they'd had success downtown and had success in Atlantic City, and the availability of capital markets, which were more accessible than they certainly were in the times of Sarno, who couldn't raise money for his Grandissimo. They said, okay, what works at Caesar's Palace? What works at the International? What works at the Flamingo? So the International, the Hilton. What works at the Flamingo? What works in various places? Who are the customers? How can we bring them together? They did not have the confidence that a 3,000 room mega resort for wealthy folk, whether the market was ready for that yet, but they were proved with the Bellagio that there was. However, it is undoubted that the Mirage, from development to opening and operations, is the most carefully considered property that has ever opened. There was no wriggle room. There was no room for error in getting that property from the ground and opening and operating. And you're right, in terms of innovation, they looked at everything. What were the optimum distances that people would walk from the elevator shaft to the room, in a way that the other properties of the time missed a couple of tricks. For example, the MGM Grand, the distances to walk were considerable. But certainly the Mirage was very carefully considered, very architecturally tight. And I think you have to thank, Joel Bergman, the late Joel Bergman, for that. And again, we talk about it being a themed property. It wasn't like Paris, where it was a replica of Paris, or the Venetian, where it was a replica of Venice. It was about how you feel. They'd taken that Sarno sense of escapism and tried to replicate the idea of being on vacation. It was the first property to be scented. If you remember the original color palette of the Mirage, it was bright, it was happy, people smiled. And the deliberate strategy or aim of those operating the Mirage was for you to have positive emotional connections with the property, have memories of being the property. And if you have a positive memory and a positive experience, you will be back. And it was the first to take emotional loyalty deliberately as a strategy. And again, if you see the way that loyalty has dominated the Las Vegas strategic thinking or gaming strategic thinking over the last 20 years, you can almost point to the Mirage as the one that professionalized and revolutionized casino operations and management to that extent.
So very influential. But what's interesting is, from what you're saying, you can see the influence of, for example, Caesar's Palace, which we just talked about on the Mirage. And but in terms of perhaps target markets, we're looking at a totally different kind of customer segment, perhaps, to what the Stardust would have been looking at.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, if you look at the customer universe of each particular time, right? Las Vegas was built, or the golden age of Las Vegas was built for the golden generation. That was post Second World War markets. And again, even Caesar's Palace was still very much trying to attract the same customer that the sands and the dunes and the river trying to attract. It wasn't particularly trying to bring in new people. What the Mirage did was it appealed to people who are Wynn's age, who are boomers, effectively, as we call them now. But we call them post Second World War, international, more cultured, better traveled, more aspirational Americans and global customers. And to an extent, that hadn't really been catered for in Las Vegas at that time. And you saw, as a consequence of the Mirage, those 14 properties open in the next 10 years, all predominantly catering for, post-Second World War born leisure and gaming customers.
So out of 10.
Well, again, this is another 10.
Okay,
You
another
know,
10.
it's the lodestar for casino development and casino design. You know, and for the professionalization. Again, without the Mirage, there would be no Marina Bay Sands, there would be no modern Macau, there'd be no modern Las Vegas. It transcends casino development, and it's a much bigger, much more important property for, you know, resort and hospitality industry. Full stop.
No, and it leaves with some legacy. Next up, you've gone for the Venetian, and the word that stood out, conventions. So we're talking about quite a departure from perhaps what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, I mean, you got to remember that Sheldon Adelson, who built the Venetian, wasn't a gambling guy. He was a business guy. You know, and to understand the property, you have to understand the man a little bit. You know, Adelson had set up and run. He'd been in the travel industry, and he'd run conventions. He needed a convention center, and he needed a space to build a convention center and then build a hotel to it. So he had already built the convention center attached to the Sands Hotel, demolished the Sands Hotel, and then built the Venetian in its place. And Adelson's thinking was, if people are prepared to spend $250 a night for a room in New York or Orlando or Chicago, why, if I created an all-suite property with the nicest rooms, the best restaurants adjacent to the convention center, why wouldn't they spend $200 a night in Las Vegas? And that was completely, to a large extent, contrarian to what was happening in Las Vegas at the time. Even the Mirage did not spend a lot of money on its rooms. The rooms were small. Right? They didn't want customers to spend time in the rooms. So in many cases, the rooms were basic unless it were a high roller suite. They wanted to get people out of the rooms and into the casino. Adelson was much more pragmatic in terms of revenues. You know, he ran the hotel almost as if it were a shopping mall or a real estate deal, where you sell off or lease multiple aspects of the operations. Famously opened without a buffet. You know, the hotel didn't operate the restaurants; they were on lease. So he was much happier. Not the hospitality model that we had seen at the Mirage or traditionally in Las Vegas, but changed the business model. And again, I think most properties nowadays are using third-party brands or lease deals within certain elements of the business, where it was almost unheard of prior to that. Again, you know, the theming piece, you know, I don't think anybody particularly goes and stays in the Venetian because they want to be in Venice, but certainly Venice and Paris have emotional resonance as cities with customers. They love them. So we've taken on various elements of the strategy which we'd seen in the previous 10, 15 years, but the Venetian wasn't about gaming. It wasn't about fantasy. It was a really cold, pragmatic business decision, and it changed Las Vegas and Las Vegas customers. If you look at the previous generation of resorts that had kind of opened in Las Vegas, you had Treasure Island in 93, you had Treasure Island, Luxor, and MGM Grand all opening within 6 or 8 weeks of each other. And a lot of them were aimed towards families, if you consider that Excalibur had opened before. What Adelson said was the business customers are as important or more important than these family customers that we're seeking to attract. And he was proved right. And again, if you take away high-end gamers, even convention customers are the most important demographic of visitors across the city.
Yeah, of course, it still stands today right across from the Mirage, and let alone standing today. We do G2E every year at the Venetian. It's, as you say, I think that at first, I think you first wrote in Gaming America, I think it was during the pandemic, that point that if you take gaming out of Las Vegas, it could still survive, but if you took conventions out, it simply couldn't. And it's just amazing to think, given the history and even popular culture with movies and entertainment and shows, that actually that is so vital to Las Vegas now. And on that basis, I mean, where would you go with the influence rating?
As an 8 in terms of in terms of I would give Adelson a greater influence rating than the property. However, I think what one should think about is today in Las Vegas we have 10 million square feet of convention and meeting space. Right, we have 22,000 meetings and conventions. We have more large conventions than any other city in America. I think large conventions than every other city in America combined. And the new owners, Vici and Apollo, are spending over $1 billion on renovating a property after buying it for $6.5 billion. So this will tell you this is a phenomenal property, a great asset, and one that will dominate the market for years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. The fifth, number 5, the Cosmopolitan, and I've gone for youth, having read your write up. Interesting choice. Tell us all about it.
Yeah, so the Cosmopolitan wasn't the first property for the next generation of customers. Let's make that clear. You'd seen the Hard Rock open in '95 off the Strip, so a whole generation before, where young people and slightly older people bashed together in this wild setting. If you'll be far too young to know the effect of rehab day club to the psyche of young American or young people all over the world who watched enviously of the shenanigans going on in the pool, or the Palms nightclub, the Palms casino resort, opened by the Maloofs, which was the first property to have big DJ clubs in it, and European style nightlife. So they were very much youth or young people orientated. What the Cosmopolitan did was it said, we have to create something different for a different type of customer that is already here on the Strip. Now, part of it was due to the constraints of the building. It was built on approximately 8 acre footprint, roughly, give or take, a couple of points, the same size as the lake at the Bellagio that it overlooks. It went up rather than out. It created an urban setting because the nature of food and beverage was constrained. They couldn't put it around the casino floor. It had to go up. And the team that programmed it had experience at Caesar's Palace when they understood the idea of culture and loyalty and creating an offering for a particular type of customer and to have that emotional resonance. So yes, it was iterative to what was in the market, and the psychology was also iterative, but the customer was new. And what it meant was, and why I think it changed Las Vegas, it became a beacon of aspiration for the then under 40s, even the under 30s. This is the coolest hotel to stay in. It is for people like us. If you go to the Mirage or the Bellagio or the Wynn or the Venetian, which effectively were the leading properties in town at that time, you could very easily meet your parents in the lobby in the morning. You didn't meet your parents in the Cosmopolitan, with the balconies, which were of huge attraction to, which were because the property was originally developed as apartments. The room sizes were naturally bigger. The amenities were different, and it really struck a chord in terms of the design aesthetic and the programming, particularly the programming. And I think this is the other thing which I've given a lot of thought to as well. The food and beverage that was in there was not just functional. It wasn't just a revenue generator. And boy, it was a revenue generator with that customer. It defined the property as something more urban And I say urban in the, in like the restaurants and food and beverage could be seen in Chicago or London or New York or DC. You weren't pulling in, celebrity chefs from the way they had it in the MGM properties of the time. No disrespect to the likes of Mina's, the great restaurants, but you had Jose Andreas. They were much younger, cooler chefs and offerings and brands than you saw across the strip. And again, that was the catalyst. Oh, something's just changing on my computer, excuse me. That was the catalyst to the next generation of customers to come to Las Vegas. And if you look at what's happened over the course of the last 10, 12, 13 years, 14 years since the Cosmopolitan's opened, Las Vegas customers have got progressively younger. And moreover, it's kind of sticking now. So it used to, that generation who came 10, 15 years ago are still coming. But the generation, the millennials who were coming very, very young are still coming. And we need to start looking at, Gen Z now, even though people aren't necessarily gambling or of age to gamble or of age to play, we need to start thinking, because the development cycle, for the Cosmopolitan was 20 years ago now.
Yeah, you kind of jumped in with a point I was going to make. I was going to reference your recent article, Generation Next, and obviously with the audiences and the things that properties have to do today to attract a younger customer. For example, the Mohegan CEO, Ray Pino, he recently said to me, used the phrase Instagrammable moments. I couldn't imagine a casino CEO maybe 5-10 years ago even necessarily knowing perhaps what Instagram is, never mind using it as part of the business strategy. But certainly, given that drive today that's needed from casinos, I suppose that really puts the Cosmopolitan high up and prompts me to give you the influencer rating.
Yeah, well, I think it's a 7 or an 8, right? In terms of because it will define every other casino that's going up around the country has a little bit of a Cosmopolitan in it in terms of that youthfulness. But I will say one thing, again, about this influencer thing. I think the best casino developers, and I'm talking about through history with that Sarno or Wynn or whoever, were Instagrammable thinking before Instagram, right?
Cool before it was cool.
not cool. I'm talking about visually. If you can visually, how many people have their photographs outside the front of Caesar's Palace, in front of the driveway and the fountains? How many people have photographs of the volcano? The idea of creating a visual memory, albeit in a traditional photograph, was something that was innate to developers and visionaries at that time. Just the rest of the world is much more conscious of it now. Again, you take a walk around the Wynn. I guarantee there are at least 100 postcards, right? Postcard photographs in the Wynn that you could take that are picture perfect, that are framed with corridors and sight lines and lighting, right? That's not an accident. The guys who developed and conceived these knew what they were doing. So I think, we talk about Instagrammable moments. Vegas has been doing this for 50 years.
Fair enough. So let's maybe talk about who missed out. We mentioned the Bellagio, and what I might do actually is encourage anyone who reads the article, anyone who watches this video, to maybe come up with a top 5 of their own, because as you wrote in the piece, it's it could create a lot of debate.
Like I said, I'm open to. I had dinner with a bunch of guys a couple of weeks ago, and we were having this conversation, and people were aghast that I didn't talk about the Flamingo in there. And I have my reasons for it, because I don't think it was. Anyway, for what it's worth, I think the Flamingo had a long incubation before it became a property, and its influences were from, LA and Paris rather than the likes of the and I was very much into what the competitive set was. I think the Bellagio is one which was certainly one of probably the most important property in terms of the financing of Las Vegas and prove how productive a casino could be in terms of revenue. That said, a lot of it was, and it's probably the most defining property in Las Vegas today. But I think too much of it is iterative from the Mirage. And if one were to have to pick between the Mirage and the Bellagio as the properties that changed Las Vegas, I think my money would be on the Mirage. Again, with the win, it is stunning to look at and stunning to walk around. But there is a lineage. There is a clear lineage that runs between Caesar's Palace, Sarno, Steve wins Mirage, Steve wins Bellagio, Steve wins Wynn. And what's a bit of a shame that in a very short period, we're taking out a block of that lineage. So when I take tours and I talk to groups and we walk the floor of the Mirage and we point things out, one will be able to point at the Hard Rock guitar and say that is where the Mirage used to be. Mm-hmm. And I never thought I would be saying that.
Absolutely. Perhaps as a final segment, we can look ahead, and I think the guitar might be quite central to that conversation. But I know you mentioned the Sphere earlier, and I know it's had literally changed the skyline of Las Vegas. I know it opened to some costs and expenses, but I suppose a property of that nature is perhaps inevitable. If we were to be having this conversation in a few years, do you think the Sphere, is right up there in terms of not a casino, but a property that has really changed Vegas?
100%. 100%. So I just spent the last I was away for the last month and a half or so, and I was traveling across the world really, and people kept saying to me, "You're from Las Vegas. What's the Sphere like?" This has become one of the most important, or certainly the most attractive buildings, structures in the world. And it's only in Vegas. I mean, it is to this generation what the Mirage was in terms of spectacle, in terms of attraction. There's a couple of things. It is undoubtedly a spectacular building. I'm a cynical old Scotsman, but when I go by it or drive by it, every time I just think it's absolutely amazing to see it. And if you look at now that the artist programming is becoming is building out with the likes of the Eagles, and I'm sure more people will be announced in the next 18 months or so, it's giving more and more customers the opportunity to experience a venue like no other. However, much as like the Mega Resort, when the Mega Resort period opened in the 1990s, it led to increased obsolescence to the older properties. And I think one of the things that we are seeing in Las Vegas is the Sphere is kind of sucking the entertainment dollars away from other venues. So, unless you have a headliner, an Adele or a Gaga or a Bruno Mars, the smaller entertainment offering staples, the magicians and, the Cirque du Soleil shows to a large extent, those production shows, customers can't afford to spend X $100 on tickets to a production show, and why, $100 for a show at the Sphere, and currently the Sphere or the other headliners are winning. So you're seeing the consequences of the Sphere changing Las Vegas, and it's making that whole entertainment piece much more challenging, both from a booking point of view and a programming point of view.
Mm-hmm. And another one in a few years, to sort of throw my 2 cents in, I'm surprised by this myself, but if you ask me my favorite property, and I think I talked to you about this when we were at this property, but actually Circa is my favorite at the moment. I think it's had a good impact on downtown, and it's won Global Gaming Awards galore already. Derek Stevens, an influential figure. I mean, it might not be on the same scale in terms of influence as perhaps the properties that we've mentioned, but I don't know if maybe in a few years how you think we'd look back on the legacy of this very kind of flashy, very beautiful looking property in an area that wasn't necessarily associated with that kind of property in the past.
Yeah, Circa's a game changer in terms of downtown Las Vegas, and there's a huge amount of resonance, I think, with Circa and regional properties as well. Not just are the operations top notch and the programming fantastic, but the idea of using community as a driver of visitation. So the use of sport, it's not just the best place in the world to watch sport. It's also the second best place in the world to watch sport. In the state, if you're not at the game, vastly it's better. Sometimes better to watch it there than be at the game. But the idea of watching with people, the idea of bringing people together, is something that was that downtown, that Fremont had encouraged in the last 10 years, and Circa has kind of become the hub for that. It's taken it on spades. So you can watch any game, whether it be soccer, hockey, baseball, basketball, American football, in that venue, and you're with 4,000 like-minded people. If the weather's nice, you can go out to the pool and watch it outside in the sunshine. It is strategically very, very tight, but moreover, from a revenue and an operating point of view, there are bars and restaurants every 50 feet. Right? It's a place where you're encouraged to go and interact and drink and engage. And by the way, if you go up to the Legacy Bar on the ground floor and you take the elevators upstairs to see the panoramic views of Las Vegas, there is a photograph of Jay Sarno on the wall at the opening of Circa Circus. Right? That's not an accident, right? Because Derek Stevens, who is probably the best operator in the world, and Circa is certainly won the North American Casino Award, Best Casino, for the last 3 years in a row, has studied this stuff. He knows about the psychology of people. And whereas 60 years ago, the attraction was to get people awed and escape from reality, what people want now, what this next generation now want, are to be with other people for a sense of belonging and for a sense of community. And sport does that. And again, trying to understand that these real estate assets are not about the bricks and the mortar. They're about the people you want to come into them and why they come in, and understand them. And that's the difference. That's what each of these 5 properties have done. Right? They've understood who their customers are. Most of those customers have not had something in this market for them already. And it has given them these properties have met the needs of that customer demographic, whether that is functional or emotional or any other need that they had. These properties have met them, and to a much smaller extent in downtown Las Vegas, Circa has done exactly the same.
There's a number of others we could inevitably talk about, but we also undoubtedly couldn't mention every single one. I think we've talked about the guitar. I think that could be a good note to end on, because obviously we're in a position where it's not up yet. We don't know exactly, a great many number of different things could unfold. But how do you see it fitting into the Las Vegas skyline? Because just even physically, just saying, hey, there's a big guitar in Las Vegas, it is a game changer, even just on an aesthetic level.
Yeah. So let's, if you take a look at a broader look, you have Fontainebleau, Resorts World, a new property down by the proposed baseball stadium. You're looking at a Tillman Fertitta Post Oak property going up, and a Hard Rock opening up within a decade span. Hard Rock is slightly different. It is a great operator with a diversified database, but it's not, I say this in the nicest possible way, it's not a high-end luxury brand. The Hard Rock brand is a cool counter-culture, anti-establishment brand with music at its core. It is far more populist and accessible and consumable than what those other brands are. I think, if one looks at the new properties coming to Las Vegas and the pantheon of brands and operators that come, Hard Rock is a known quantity. Its customers are known quantities, and the programming, we don't quite know exactly what it's going to be, but I can tell you it's going to be very accessible and very consumable. And in many ways, it's much, if one looks at those, those properties we talked about, it's a Stardust. It's much more of a Stardust than it is anything else. It says we're going to be big, we're going to offer loads of stuff, we're going to be really accessible, and because of our size, scale, and offering, we're going to attract our type of customers that we want. Is it a game changer? I think, the strategic positions are laid out. If it's done well, it's very difficult for it. If the property is developed well, it's very difficult for it not to do well in this market. Hard Rock's customers are already here, right? And that property will just, scoot them up.
Yeah. So I say this often in gaming, plenty to look forward to, but here I really do mean it. And as you say, in about 10 years, we could see, we're seeing a lot of change, a lot of potential for the future. Even recently, like you say, that the Fontainebleau only just opened. Resorts World is pretty new. But as you say, things are always changing in Las Vegas, and that will never change.
Yeah, I mean, that's been the one great thing about studying the history and the evolution of this place. These properties span decades, from 58 in the case of Stardust to 2010 with the Cosmopolitan. It takes Segerblom, the Clark County Commissioner, said recently, the last 5 years in Las Vegas, we've had the Sphere, Resorts World, Fontainebleau, Allegiant Stadium, and a Stanley Cup winning side out with the new team. Any two of those in any other city would be completely defining. We've had 5 in the last 5 years, and all we're talking about is what's coming next. That is the wonder of being and working in this city. And I would encourage many of your viewers and readers of the magazine, if you haven't come and experienced this place, find a time, find a week, just walk around.
Fully in agreement there. But Oliver, as always, a pleasure speaking with you. Thanks very much for your time. Really enjoyed the in-depth discussion, and I'm sure we'll do it again soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Always a pleasure. And to our viewers as well, thanks for watching, and I'm sure you learned something. Hope you enjoyed the discussion.